Before we begin the more formal part of the evening, I want to pause and pay short tributes to two members, both past presidents, who sadly passed away this year. The first is Paul Henderson Scott, to whom a fuller tribute was paid at the last dinner after resigning from the club's council on account of ill health. Paul's funeral service was held at Warriston Crematorium on the 2nd of April, and several club members were there among a large attendance. The tribute was paid by another ex-president of ours, James Robertson, and one anecdote came up during the service which I'd like to share with you. On Paul's retirement from the diplomatic service in 1986 and his resettling in Edinburgh, intent on forging a new career in letters, his early efforts to participate in the Scottish nationalist movement were apparently viewed with grave suspicion. How could a graduate of the Royal High School and Edinburgh University, who had served in the 7th Armoured Division during the war and with a distinguished past career with the Foreign Office, be anything other than a spy? However, Paul was eventually accepted at his word, and his support for the SNP, of which he became vice chairman, was thereon unerring. Though, as remarked in last year's tribute, and from my own experience, never conducted with personal animus, Paul played the ball, not the opponent. Mind if the opponent got in the way, but still. The second tribute concerns Professor Jane Milgate, our president in 2002, who died this January after a protracted period of ill health. Jane finally returned to her Toronto home after a period in hospital with the express intention of settling her affairs in the final weeks of her life. Those of us who knew Jane are aware how typical this was for someone who controlled her own research activities so well during a distinguished academic career, while guiding those of others. She leaves behind a remarkable legacy of pioneering scholarship, which has laid the foundation for almost all recent advances in Scot criticism and textual study. To pick out some of the highlights, her work includes the first modern critical study of wavy novels to see Scott's output in its immediate publishing context, that's The Making of the Novelist, 1984, a classic study of the magnum opus edition in the final years of Scott's life, Scott's last edition, 1987, and last but not least, the online Union Catalogue of Scott's Correspondence, hosted by the National Library of Scotland, an immense resource for future scholarship. Jane's work was exceptional in a sometimes egoistical world of scholarship, in never being self-enclosed, but always inviting extension and parallel development elsewhere, and I speak as one of the beneficiaries. She'll be sorely missed. It's a pleasure now to turn to introducing our current president, and I'll be taking another 3 or 4 minutes, Maxwell. Maxwell MacLeod. This is on the back of your cards in very small print. This is just a digest of it. But as some of you know, it's our practice at council meetings when selecting presidents to alternate academics with people from a broader background, in shorthand, for want of a better term, non-academics. Sir Maxwell was invited under the latter heading. The label sits uneasily on someone whose career has all the marks of a veritable polymath at work. The Honourable Sir Maxwell MacLeod of Funerary, to give him his full title, was educated at Gordonston, a contemporary of Prince Charles, he tells me just now, Durham and Oxford. He taught in an East London comprehensive school for over 6 years before leaving as an educational audiologist specialising in high-frequency deafness. He's been a journalist, writing for over 10 newspapers with a regular column in the Herald. His other activities include running expeditions through the Hebrides, starting an energy advisory business, and lecturing in Japan, Washington and Mississippi, where I believe you met Professor Tom Richardson, who's our next speaker but one.
Indeed.
Yes. Among present positions, he is Senior President of the Speculative Society and President of Glasgow's Nomad Society. He's a great traveller, having circled the world several times, with special interest in the Middle East. His great hobby is long-distance sea rowing, which sounds terribly arduous, but perhaps it's the way to get around when you live in Morven, I don't know. So Maxwell's interest in Scott was fuelled by a family connection with William Laidlaw, and he has various mementos derived from that source that he wants to draw our attention to today. I must say that my own ears pricked up when I heard that Laidlaw was to be a focus of attention, since in a number of ways he seems to become the forgotten person in the Scott story, albeit in reality one of the most constant factors there. It was Laidlaw who was present at the family farm in Blackhouse when needed to guide Scott's pursuit of ballads in Yarrow and Ettrick, among other things facilitating his crucial meeting in 1802 with James Hogg. It was he who acted as an amanuensis in 1819 when Scott's stomach cramps occasioned him dictating material, a role that he fulfilled also in later years. And it was to Laidlaw's care at Abbotsford that Scott was to send off antiquarian books that he'd purchased while attempting to recuperate from his strokes in Naples in 1832. One could only assume that unlike some other associates of Scott, such as the Ettrick Shepherd and that young Turk J.G. Lockhart, Laidlaw was not one prone to draw attention to himself, and as a result has been historically undervalued. With that in mind, it's a great pleasure to anticipate something of a corrective in the offing from Sir Maxwell MacLeod.
Thank you, Peter. What a nice man he is. Do you know that he was at school, maybe at school with Prince Charles, and I tried to impress him with that, and he said he was at school with Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, which is far more impressive. Brian Jones used to hit him on the back of the head when he was in class. Just thought you might like to know that. Now I'm going to say something which is almost suicidal to start off with. I'm a little nervous given the company and the fact there's a very big drop down into Princes Street, and you've all been drinking a little. When I was a boy and a middle-aged man, I didn't like Walter Scott. I found him very, very difficult to get into. I found it very challenging. I'm no intellect at all, and I found him immensely challenging. This was particularly awful, given the fact that, well, I was taught by Eric Henderson, of course, one of the great Scott experts. My father gave me a book of Scott's poems when I was a child. And worst of all, I'm directly descended from William Laidlaw, who was Scott's secretary and amanuensis. So it was ridiculous that I just couldn't have the application to really get into him. But what's happened to me in the last couple of years has completely turned me around. And I'm now a huge supporter, and I'm very, very excited by his work. I suppose when I was young, I was very left-wing, and I kind of was concerned that Scott was involved in the Anglicisation of Scotland. This establishment of class systems, I just felt this was not me, this is not where we should go to. And it was extremely difficult because, well, I didn't know what I was talking about at the time. And I kind of ignored Scott through most of my existence. And then my mother, when we were young, said, "You'd never guess. We've inherited something from Laidlaw." Now, I knew that Laidlaw was my ancestor by about 7 generations, but I didn't know much about him. Now, there's one or two people here, in particular Alan MacLean, who knew my mother very well. And she was a warm and giving person who, not a normal moderator's wife, she used to smoke small cigars, and if we ever saw a fire engine going through town, she would chase it to see where we would go. So she was a fun, exciting woman, and just such joyful. When we left the house, she would always give us a hug and say, "Listen, if you don't like it, you can always come home." She was that kind of woman, and she said, "We've inherited a box, the Laidlaw box." I'll show it to you. Here's the Laidlaw box. It's got the initials of Laidlaw's wife on it. And she would say, this is the Laidlaw box. Unfortunately, we've lost the key, but I bet you, if we could just get into this box, it'd be full of letters from Walter Scott, William Laidlaw, James Hogg, if we could only find the key. And she would take a pin out of her hair and she would try and unpick the Laidlaw box. And we'll say, Mum, what's for dinner tonight? We just didn't believe it for a second. It sat for 20 years on our mantelpiece. True story. Neil, true story?
True story.
My brother Neil, God bless him. And then one awful day in 1984, my mother dropped dead with a heart attack. And she was only 63, and it was a terribly sad day in the house. And you know, you obsess about these things when a storm like that hits the house. And I said, I know what I'm going to do. And I went and I got a screwdriver. I put it into the box. And I broke it open. I'll never forget that moment. What do you think I found? I'll tell you later. Before I tell you what I found in the box, I am going to tell you about some of the characters who were involved in my falling in love with Walter Scott, because they tie in with that story. Of course, there was William Laidlaw, who was a not particularly successful farmer on the borders, became a friend of Walter Scott. Then there was James Hogg, his cousin, who worked as a shepherd for William Laidlaw. And then there was Purdy, the poacher, and they all lived near Abbotsford. Abbotsford, in case you don't know, and there can't be many people here who don't know, except probably Neil. Abbotsford was a small farm with 100 acres, which Walter Scott bought and extended to 1,400 acres. And he brought in to work with him, of course, William Laidlaw and James Hogg, and Purdy the poacher was up before him as a magistrate, and he brought him to work in for him. So these were the characters. And so they all became friends. I've got a rather silly story here to tell, which I was a bit nervous about telling, but I'm just going to go and tell it anyhow. I became fascinated by what I found in the books. Okay, I'll show you what I found in the book. I found dozens and dozens of letters. Letters, original letters from Walter Scott, original letters from James Hogg, original letters from Sophie Lockett, dozens and dozens of unpublished letters, unpublished poems, possibly by this one here, possibly by Walter Scott, possibly by James Hogg. We're going to have to look at it. Dozens and dozens of unpublished letters. What do you think I felt when I opened that box, saw this extraordinary breakthrough in Scottish literary history? I thought I wish my mum was there. It was extraordinary. And what was I to do? Well, at the time, my father was 90 years old and he was surrounded by his archives, and I was going to hand over all the archives to the National Library of Scotland. So I just put the Laidlaw archives in with those MacLeod archives and handed them over. There was, and they are here, four letters from Walter Scott himself, handwritten, signed. Other letters, as I say, from Laidlaw, Hogg, all original. Neil doesn't let me take them out of the box, he's quite right. And so I took the majority of the letters to the National Library of Scotland, and they spent some years cataloguing all of my father's letters along with them. And also, I asked Neil to take the main letters into his own command. I didn't want to just throw the really important letters into the 14 large boxes of my father's stuff. And Neil took them off to the West Highland Museum. Were you a trustee of the West Highland Museum?
Yeah.
Neil was a trustee of the West Highland Museum. And we have a good friend called Fiona Marwick. Those of you in the legal business in Scotland will know the Marwick legal firm. And what was particularly extraordinary about handing it over to Fiona for her safekeeping was that her father, her ancestor, was something called Isaac, who had a particular interest in Water Scott archives. Are you nodding? Can you tell me quickly about Isaac? He went to America and he sold some of these. How great that you should know that. He is good, this guy. He took them and he sold these documents to an American university. Now I think the National Library of Scotland bought them back, is that correct? And he changed his name to Scott. So how extraordinary that Fiona, who had this interest in those papers, should then be asked to have a look at our papers. And we kept them and we kept them and we kept them. Now you may wonder why somebody who is not an academic and didn't used to be a great fan of Walter Scott should have been asked to have this great honour of being your president. Well, it's quite simple. I started to blather around town. Do you know, I've got some papers here in a box. I don't really know much about them. And they said, well, would you like to come along and speak at this, Miss Mackenzie? So would you like to come along and speak and tell us all about them? And I said, of course I would. And so for the last few months, my head has been down amongst those papers. And it has turned me round. It has really turned me round. I think I had a resistance to the stylized form of Scott's work, but when I started looking at the fun these guys were having down in Abbotsford, the friendship, the egalitarianism, the teasing, I started to realize that Scott wasn't the pompous man which I had assumed, and that to an extent so much of his work is parody and fun. And when you go down to Abbotsford and you go into these extraordinary halls surrounded by weapons, you start to realize that he's a playful man. And when you start to read his work, you realize he has humor, and he's playful, and he's enjoyable, and that the friendships that are developed and that can be seen through these letters was so encouraging. This is the weird story I want to tell you. I do quite a lot of my work here in the club. I sit because there's no, the telephone doesn't ring, people don't come and annoy you, you can just work away and go and get a cup of coffee. And as a result of which I've got to know quite a few members of the staff, just in an informal way. And there's a great, great staff here at the club, really nice people. And one night I was walking along and I met somebody who I've known for years. I'll never tell anybody which member of the staff it was. And as he passed, he said, good evening, Sir Maxwell. And I stopped him and I said, you don't have to call me Sir Maxwell, it's just an inherited title. My friends sometimes call me Sir Maxwell, but they're just taking the piss. And he said, oh, I can assure you, Sir Maxwell, I was taking the piss too. What was so delicious about that moment was I was up to my ears in these papers. And I went back and I sat and I looked at those papers and I thought, that's what being Scottish is about. The fact that we tease each other, the fact that he wasn't in any way being derogatory, he was being fun and friendly. And there was so much in these letters which indicate that Scott was a fun and friendly person and brought in his pals. I don't really have time to read all these letters, you'll be glad to hear. I'll just tell you a few. The few of the ones that I really liked. My favourite actually was from James Hogg, the Untitled Chapter. It was 1800, the year before he met Scott. And he said, I've just had a really great day out. I'm just going to paraphrase some of these letters for the fun of it. I've just had a really good fun day out. I went to Edinburgh because there was going to be a firework display at the castle. What an incredible display it was. And I had some work to do up north. And I walked to the Queen's Ferry. And I got across on the Queen's Ferry. You never guess, I met a woman. This is writing to William Laidlaw, who was his cousin and his friend. I met this woman. She's from our village. And I said, I know you and you various people in common. And I said, how are you getting on? She said, well, my leg's still a bit sore, but it's getting better. And I gave her a shilling, and she showered me with blessings. And then, you know, I got onto a horse and cart, because I had to go north to do some work. And my heaven, you should have seen the speed that man went on the horse and cart. It was exactly like he was sitting on the back of a Hebridean eagle, and he had been in Edinburgh, and he decided he really wanted to get home, and he wanted to get home fast. That's what it was like sitting on that horse and cart. And now I'm writing this letter from we in at Kinross, and it's overlooking Queen Mary's castle. Now, that sounds like a great day out, doesn't it? But it also sounds very human. And then you've got letters, of course, saying from Laidlaw saying, oh, well, of course, really nice to, it's really nice of you, given I'm in trouble, to help me with giving me a farm here at Abbotsford and a wee bit of a job. And Scott writes back, you know, oh, well, of course, don't worry, it's actually not you that's doing you a favour, it's you that's doing me a favour, let me tell you. Because, you know, I'll just give you a wee bit of grass for a cow, and you can come down if you're short of a job to do, and we can do some work because you're a great poet. This warmth of this tenderness of these people together. And then, of course, we have James Hogg, who is, I think Lockhart called him, what was it, a drunken blether or something like that. He's a chancer, but he's a charming chancer, and he's always writing to Laidlaw saying, you know, listen, can you just lend me some money? You know, it's the beginning of the season. If I could borrow some money now, I could maybe buy a few sheep, you know. And then he says, and if you have, maybe you could ask Sir Walter if he's sure, you know. And it's just so domestic, and it's so charming, and it's so enchanting. And once you start making that breakthrough into realizing what fun these people were having, you can then start working more into the poetry and into the novels, and it's been of an immense benefit to me. I just want to say the last thing, and that is that David Purdy and I went to Tibet a few months ago, because we heard that the Dalai Lama was reaching the end of, well, this one of his lives. His people are looking for rebranding Tibet. And I thought it was a bit of a nonsensy idea of us going to talk to the Dalai Lama about Walter Scott. But you know, when we got there, we found there was tremendous friendships between everybody in that community. And we talked about Walter Scott's community in Abbotsford. And that friendships that I've been talking about engendered there was somehow paralleled in MacLeod Ganj. And when his people came over, they stayed with us, and on the 25th of June, 10 people are coming over to discuss what is going on in Tibet. Maybe this is not the time to talk about climate change, but the things that are happening in the Tibet Peninsula are perhaps the most significant climate change crisis taking place in the world at present. The Tibet Plateau, not the peninsula, the plateau, is the water tank of 1/5 of the people in the world. So what is happening in that area is so critical, and it's so vital, and how extraordinary that the warmth of these people has been transferred into us having discussions between the Scottish Parliament and the Tibet. I know it sounds a little bizarre, but it really was extraordinary to see how we could use that as a bridge. So what am I going to do now with the papers? Well, I can tell you in all seriousness that very few of the papers which I handed over to the National Library of Scotland have been accessed by experts on Walter Scott. So there's a huge file in the George MacLeod archives which you can go and access. And the is it 6 letters, Neil, from?
4 letters.
4 letters from Walter Scott. We've now had them transcribed. And as an expression of goodwill to your organisation, we are going to allow you to be possibly the 4th person ever to read these 4 letters. I am transferring them tomorrow to Peter. We very much hope that those who are experts will analyse them and engage with them. And we also hope that, that these intimate letters can be used as a bridge between those who are not reading Walter Scott and those who ought to be. Because that's what it's done for me. He is a very, very extraordinary and wonderful storyteller. I am very privileged to have been your president, and I would like you to raise a glass and drink to Sir Walter Scott.
Thank you, Maxwell. As the applause demonstrates, that was quite sensational. We do benefit as a club by having people coming to give us speeches who have family connections through their ancestors with Scott, but this was a particularly striking case, and we're very, very grateful for the way that you've shared this with us and are going to allow us access to this material. And I think you're dead right about the playfulness of Scott, you know. The Victorians turned him into a sort of saint-like figure, and that picture, portrait of him looking all like a Roman emperor by Raeburn, is the classic image of Scott. But he was a fun guy, he really was. And you've picked that up. People can pick that up from the novels, and you've picked it up from the contents of the box. So thank you very, very much for that. Sir Walter Scott was born on the 15th of August 1771 in this city. He began his education at the high school here. It was at the University of Edinburgh that he undertook his law classes. During the span of his professional career as a clerk of the Court of Session, he spent at least half of each year in Edinburgh, and it was while he was residing here that a considerable amount of his work was written. The forced sale of 39 Castle Street in 1826 as a result of insolvency was clearly one of the most painful events in Scott's life, involving not only the loss of a vital foothold, but also, as he saw it, a rupture in his lifelong citizenship. One indicator of Scott's commitment to the city can be found in the song that he wrote for George IV's visit to the city in 1822, "Carl, Now the King's Come." While Scott has been accused of willfully tartanising Scotland on this visit, the King's visit that is, more on that later, reference to the song itself shows that it is at least as much as anything a homage to Edinburgh and its folk, spoken as much of it is by Auld Reekie, the name from the smoke and not the smell, by the way, personified in the form of a grey-cloaked Carline. Homage is paid in the process to the city's craftsmen with their ceremonial blanket blue, to the fine stone buildings, tacitly in comparison with London's bricks. I'll show him mason work the day, nay your bricks of Babel clay. And also to the then Lord Provost, Sir William Arbuthnot, who was formerly made a baronet by the King at a dinner in Parliament House. My trusty Provost, tried and tight, stand forth for the good town's right. There's war than you being made a knight. Carl, now the King's come. With this and other connections in mind, ladies and gentlemen, would you please rise and join me in drinking a toast to the city of St. The city of Edinburgh. I'm now delighted to invite the present Lord Provost, Frank Ross, to respond to the toast. Frank Ross, his official title is Edinburgh's Right Honourable Lord Lieutenant and Lord Provost. As City Councillor since 2012, he was a convener of the Economy Committee for more than 3 years before becoming Deputy Leader of the Council. He became the city's 257th Lord Provost in April 2017. Born in 1959 in London, Frank moved to Glasgow at a young age before going to school in Edinburgh. He attended Leith Academy. I got it wrong, did I? Oh no, okay. He attended Leith Academy and George Watson's College and has called Edinburgh his home ever since. His qualifications include a Business Studies BA from Napier University, and he remains a Fellow of the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants. Frank's interests include bowling, curling, rugby and football. And if you were wondering about his allegiances in the last of these, he's a Hearts of Midlothian supporter. David McKay over there particularly appreciates that. Apart from that, he enjoys spending leisure time, doesn't seem to have much, but still, with the Lady Provost, Hannah Ross, and their 2 children. Ladies and gentlemen, Edinburgh's Lord Provost, Frank Ross.
Thank you, Peter. My Lord, ladies, ex-Lord Provost, distinguished guests, it gives me great pleasure to be here this evening. In fact, I've been in this room quite a few times doing exactly this, not the same speech, but a very similar speech. And it gives me great pleasure to be here once again to provide a brief reply, or say that again, a brief reply to the toast to Edinburgh. As the capital city's Lord Provost and Lord Lieutenant, I have an immense pride in our city's almost 900-year-long history and its citizens' contribution to improved economic, social welfare and built environment over those 9 centuries. Now, Scotland's leading city has over that time benefited from a very strong lineage of support both from royal benefactors, from institutions and political supporters, and indeed from a range of leading minds of the day. Royal support commenced through Mary Queen of Scots and has continued through to our current monarch, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, and has been complemented by academic and political support from our famous institutions and diplomatic missions, including the Universities of Edinburgh, Heriot Watt and Napier, and it was great news to hear this week that all 3 have moved up once again in the UK rankings of universities, with the fact Edinburgh University getting back into the top 20. And it's 16th, the highest position I think it's actually had. I only know this because I sit on the court and I got the full briefing on Monday. But also Edinburgh's Royal College of Surgeons has had a significant impact over those 9 centuries. And in surprising detail that over the years Edinburgh as a capital city has grown a community, a consular core community, which is quite extraordinary, and we now have 42 separate consulates supporting our capital city, including those of America, Canada, China, France, India, Norway, Poland, Russia, and our most recent addition, Hungary. I think that's a very clear sign of how the outside world looks at Edinburgh when so many consulates form that community around our city. But leading minds from a range of fields, including science, technology, business, architecture, engineering, and economy, and the arts, have also had a positive impact on our city over the years. Many of whom who have revolutionised our lifestyles and our well-being over the years, and several of whom were contemporaries of Scott during his time. Now this year, the International Science Festival that is based here in Edinburgh had a theme of frontiers. Now this thread of frontiers provided a platform for some of the brightest minds in science technology and engineering to share big and exciting ideas, including cutting-edge research. And without doubt, Scott's skill was pushing at the literary frontiers of his time. I'm not detailed enough to speak, but I think you all know that the skill that he had, he was pushing the profession of literary writing to the very limit in his time. And I think it's a clear sign that Edinburgh has always had people who are wishing to push things out, who are willing to take opportune chances, I think sometimes, and chances, and to take risks in taking their profession and their skill forward. And many people are clear that Sir Walter's writings were and remain his key contribution to the capital, and I think that was explained and expressed very well by the President in his speech. And a lot of people come to Edinburgh because of Scott. We receive over 4.6 million visitors a year now to the capital. Almost half of those who visit Edinburgh use museums and other venues and events which profile Scott's work. Visitor numbers to the Edinburgh Writers' Museum and indeed the Maker's Court, where Scott is commemorated, have grown by over 24% over the last few years. And alongside the growth in the Edinburgh International Book Festival, which, if you're not aware, now takes over about a third of George Street, now that it has the opportunity, and attracts half a million people now purely for the book festival annually. Both of these facts are underpinned by our continuing status as the world's first UNESCO City of Literature. And that status of being the first UNESCO City of Literature very clearly references Scott's and others' contributions. And the success of each of these venues and events is in no small part to do with the city's literary heritage and Sir Walter Scott's substantive place within it. Now, while Scott was clearly a writer of prodigious output and gained prestige and influence both nationally and internationally, his historic novels and poetry and plays were not only an important influence on romantic literature, theatre and painting, and indeed music in many countries, based upon his own life experiences, they also helped to challenge social attitudes and provide a basis for improved engagement across the social classes of the day and beyond. Edinburgh was then and continues to be an outward-looking, international, welcoming and inclusive city. Edinburgh currently is experiencing one of its strongest periods of economic growth, substantial employment and a fantastically strong student profile, the largest concentration of overseas students as a percentage of the student population anywhere in the UK. And given that the student population makes up 20% of the population of Edinburgh, that's a significant international influence. Indeed, not only is Edinburgh the strongest city economy in the UK outside of London, it's also one with the youngest demographic of all cities, including London. Now, while this is great news, and I'm never tired of telling people it's great news, there are still some similarities between our Edinburgh and that of Scots. In that, some of our citizens don't always benefit as they should from this economic strength. Today, there are still a significant number of people living in poverty as they were in Scots' day. 20% of our population today, 2019, still live in relative poverty here in the capital. And of that 20%, half of those are actually working. And for those people, relatively, I think there is probably not a lot of change between Scots' day and our day today. So when we looked at how we addressed that, we decided that we wanted to take a long-term strategy and look forward to 2050 and say, what should our city look like? What should be the key things that we should be changing? And a key element in devising our strategy was to talk to the citizens. What did they want of their city? And that resulted in the largest ever citywide engagement with our citizens that we've ever had in Edinburgh. We had over 45,000 responses to our consultation. Now, in a similar exercise, that compares to the next best, which was New York, who've been doing this for 50 years. This is our first attempt, where they got 7,000 responses. So that really shows that the people of Edinburgh are actually interested in their city and how it goes. And the really good news was that the vast majority of those responding were in our target age group of those aged under 25, the young people who were actively engaged and interested in our city. And in addition to the very strong environmental message, we had that mentioned as well by the President about climate change, I'm keen to ensure that inclusion and prosperity for all is a key benefit and a driver for change. So with these references, Sir Walter Scott's impact upon the city was, however, beyond his literature and indeed included a substantial contribution to the capital's academia reputation and place in the world. He was also, as I've said before, seen as an innovator, arguably accredited with establishing the modern historical fictional novel, and, as we've heard, presenting a fresh perspective on the culture and traditions on the Scottish Highlands. To ensure freshness in his work and to grow readership, Scott was all very deliberate in looking beyond the boundaries of Scotland and for inspiration in his works. And for example, I'm sure you all know The Surgeon's Daughter and Guy Mannering and St Ronan's Well, the Indian and Indian subcontinent cultures were brought to life by his friends' descriptions and translated into the richness of the respective novels. In more modern day, the university's Scott Digital Archive, the Writers' Museum Room dedicated to Scott, complemented by the National Library of Scotland's collection, all collaborate to maximise the footprint and access to the works, albeit some people aren't accessing them perhaps as well as we would like. I think digitisation is probably possibly the way forward on that. This, and the conversion of some of the works to film, have taken the works of Sir Walter Scott to a truly global audience, and with that, it has taken Edinburgh and Scotland to a truly global audience. Of course, in examining Scott's legacy here in the capital, you cannot fail to miss the monument in his name, some 100 metres or so from here, something which was put together by the great and good in Edinburgh in respect of the individual that they knew. And without doubt, it has become not just a monument for Scott, but it has become that iconic symbol of Scotland's capital. Nor can we ignore the references to Scott on our main railway station, not only in name, but with the snatches of his work which appear throughout the station and capture the imagination of visitors and citizens alike as they walk through there. The opening of the Borders Railway, I think, further strengthens the city's link with Abbotsford House, which is now becoming a popular destination and again assisting to open up the history and knowledge of Scott through tourism through that railway. Sir Walter Scott was in his day a master of his craft, and even in today's digital age continues to inspire new work and discussions on Scotland and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. Since we came to live in Edinburgh 10 years ago, we've been constantly struck the amount to which the city and the council are interested in the cultural affairs here, in what, in other respects, might seem a very materialistic, hard-headed world. Perhaps it is materialistic and hard-headed to cultivate culture, but we do appreciate that you do it. And a symptom of that, or a sign of it, is your readiness to come here and speak to us, and we're very grateful for that, Frank. It's also true that Scott really wanted to promote Edinburgh in many ways. We had our last talk by Dr. Gillian Hughes was about his attempt to turn the Theatre Royal just down the road there into a site for a revival of national drama. He was instrumental in making Edinburgh a great publishing centre, something which lasted beyond the 19th century. He was very much into that and aware that he was doing it. To move on, each year it's the custom of the club to invite a representative of one of the many societies and establishments with which Sir Walter was associated to join us at our annual dinner. This year we're pleased to honour Scott's membership of the Celtic Society, now the Royal Celtic Society, founded in Edinburgh on January the 20th to foster Highland dress and culture, and of which Scott was the vice president. The first references to this society in Scott's letters occur in January 1821 and concern an anticipated meeting which he jocularly presents as representing an intimidating prospect. I have before my eyes the terrors of a certain Highland association who dine kilted and bonneted in the old fashion, all save myself, of course, and armed to the teeth. And again the following May, I presided last night at the dinner of the Celtic Society, all plaided and plumed in their tartan array, and each jumping and skipping and screaming as you never saw. Don't get any ideas, please. Particularly those at the naughty table over there. Later in the same letter to his son Walter, he refers to the extreme enthusiasm of the Gael, well liberated from the thraldom of the breeches. Scott, no doubt, was partly drawn in by his friendship with co-founder General Stewart of Garth, the subject of another recent talk to the club, who evidently designed the Celtic Society's uniform based on the black watch mess dress, and which has since morphed into the ubiquitous Prince Charlie evening jacket of our times. Behind the fanfaronade of costumery lays Scott's larger project of integrating Highland culture into a newly diverse Scottish society, and beyond that, funneling the old loyalties into the larger British project. The great opportunity, already envisaged by him in 1820, arose with the King's 1822 visit, during which members of the Celtic Society had a substantial ceremonial role to play, though Scott, by his own account, also felt the need to supply some real Highlanders, in addition to what he refers to as the masquerade of the Celtic Society. With the bicentenary of the 1822 visit looming closely, perhaps there is some need to re-evaluate that event after the mauling that it's received from a number of Whig critics. At the same time, we need to honour the valuable cultural project underlying the original foundation of the Celtic Society, which it continues to fulfil to this day. So, ladies and gentlemen, please raise your glasses for our toast to the Royal Celtic Society.
Royal Celtic Society.
And I'm now very pleased to ask the chairman of the Royal Celtic Society, Alan Hay, to respond to our toast. Alan was born and bred in Aberdeenshire, though he spent most of the last 30 years in London. He was educated at Stirling University and has worked as a journalist, company director and farmer. He found his way into the world of executive search, that's headhunting, I think, in more common parlance, specialising in, not literally, no, specialising in senior media appointments, which continues to be his main business, although he still writes on matters historical and topographical for a wide range of newspapers and magazines. He joined the council of the Royal Society as a relative youngster, aged 18, he just 21, so 21. They were trying to get some young blood in, and they kept it as well till later. That was in 1984, and now he's its chairman. Here to describe the Society and some of its more recent activities, ladies and gentlemen, Alan Hay.
Lord Provost, Mr. Chairman and all, thank you for that generous toast and the very kind invitation to respond. Kilted, certainly, armed to the teeth I'm not, which may or may not be a good thing. And as Peter said, I joined the Council of the Royal Celtic Society as a 21-year-old student when they decided that they were all very old and grey and they needed a couple of token youngsters. The two token youngsters are still on the council. One is me, the other is the treasurer. And it's now he and I who are old and grey, and we need to be looking at it, I think, at the same process. Sir Walter Scott was a very big part of our early life, which began on the 4th of January 1820, with a meeting convened by a half-pay lieutenant named William Mackenzie, grandson of a Culloden veteran, in a pub called Oman's Tavern, which is situated not very far from here, almost exactly where New Register House stands today. It was only 3 weeks later that Sir Walter joined the Society, and he was immediately appointed Vice President, in which capacity he assumed and remained in the chair for some years. And it still occasionally terrifies me that I am today occupying that seat. I know I'm not fit even to clean his boots, let alone fill them, but I will try. We were one of the many societies to emerge from the European Romantic movement in Scotland, of which Glengarry's Society of the True Highlanders was probably the best known, and of which I believe we and the Highland Society of London are the sole survivors. And the activities that gave rise to the launch of these organisations inspired a major exhibition which is opening at the National Museum next month, entitled Wild and Majestic, words taken from, very obviously, from Byron's poem Dark Lochnagar, in which we will be making a modest appearance and which will certainly feature the broadsword the Celtic Society gifted to Sir Walter, which has been borrowed from Abbotsford for the occasion. As the chairman has said, we were closely associated with George IV's visit in 1822, when Glengarry, who was one of our members, became very angry that Sir Walter and the Celtic Society had stolen a march on him. He made a terrible fuss, and in the end, as the minute books record, he resigned just as we were about to expel him. As the chairman has also remarked, Colonel Stewart of Garth, himself an officer of the Black Watch, created the Celtic Society's uniform for the occasion, which still survives in a slightly different form as the Prince Charlie jacket, of which I can see there are a number around here. I used to have one of those myself, but it shrank in the wardrobe. Fortunately, my elder son is now putting it to good use. Sir Walter was a towering figure in our early history and remained closely associated with the Society until his death. His contribution valued, revered even at the time, when we broke all of our rules. Again, this is referred to specifically in the minute book, that this should never be taken as a precedent, when we made the princely contribution of 50 guineas towards the Scott Monument. I'm not sure what difference we really made in a project that cost 16,000 quid. And it does rather pale into insignificance with the 100 guineas we'd given 10 years earlier to the statue of George IV, which still stands up at the Hanover Street Junction. We began life in 1820 with a stated aim to encourage the correct wear of the Highland dress. And I would suggest that we won that argument. I would hazard a guess that almost every Scotsman today will wear a kilt at least one day in his life. That is the day he gets married. But we evolved with the times according to need. For example, after the 1872 Education Act, which was actively hostile to every tradition except English, our focus shifted to the Gaelic language. And today we're concerned with the language, literature, music and culture of Scotland, of all of Scotland, not just the Highlands and Islands. If you like, the protection of our cultural heritage. I thought I'd give you a very brief flavour of our activities today, running through them very quickly. For example, we run a monthly series of lecture series in the Dome Room at New Register House. These are public lectures that happen at lunchtime. They're informal sessions designed to accommodate members, but also visitors to Edinburgh, and workers, people who are in a lunch hour. You know, they are welcome to bring their sandwiches, and they quite often do. And if the discussion goes on beyond 2 o'clock, the witching hour, which it very often does, they are welcome to slip out. They're very informal sessions, which are very enjoyable. Last month I had the pleasure of attending the Edinburgh International Hart Festival, which was a delightful and inspiring 5-day event where we sponsored a production performed by young harpists. And currently we're involved with the Royal Society of Edinburgh's RSE at Inverness programme. This is a series of programmes run by the Royal Society of Edinburgh aimed at getting Scotland's leading academics away from their seats of learning and out into the wider community. Being the RSE, it is pretty much geared towards science, and our involvement has by sponsoring a storytelling element has enabled us has enabled them to broaden that programme out into music, story and song. So, language, literature, music, song and story. That's what we're all about today. And I think, or I hope, that Sir Walter would approve. Mr. Chairman, thank you once again for our toast to a future. It's a great privilege for me to be heard here, and you do the Royal Celtic Society a great honour in recognising us this evening.
Well, I must say, in response to that, Alan, thanks so much when we asked made inquiries of the Royal Celtic Society if they could supply a speaker. You were there post haste. You answered readily, and we're very grateful for it.
Great privilege to be asked.
And I must say, it was very interesting to see the sort of work that you're doing and what the societies like yours and perhaps ours do. And how valuable it is and can be anyway. Thank you very much. Now, to help round off our dinner, I'd now like to invite Madeleine Mackenzie, a valued member of our council, to propose a vote of thanks. Madeleine.
Thank you, Peter. Mr. Chairman, fellow members and distinguished guests, I have the very pleasant task of offering a vote of thanks to all those who have made this 110th annual dinner of the club such an enjoyable occasion. Firstly, I'd like to thank all the new club staff under the direction of Joseph, who have looked after us so well this evening. Our club president, Sir Maxwell MacLeod, has given us a fascinating and instructive account of his ancestor, William Laidlaw, a man who played such an important part in the daily life of Sir Walter, as his steward at Abbotsford, and most of all as his amanuensis and great personal friend. What a thrill it has been to hear about these wonderful letters that have been passed down in the Laidlaw box to Maxwell. Our thanks to you, Mr. President, for a most memorable toast to the memory of Sir Walter. We've also been privileged to hear from our two distinguished guests who have responded to the Chairman's toast. Our Lord Provost, Frank Ross, replying on behalf of the City of Edinburgh, and Alan Hay, replying on behalf of the Royal Celtic Society. We greatly enjoyed these responses, and gentlemen, please accept our warmest thanks. We're fortunate to have among our club members the Very Reverend Canon Alan MacLean of Dochgarach, and our thanks to him literally for gracing us this evening. Thanks to Lee Simpson, our treasurer and filmer, for making all the arrangements for the dinner and for kindly taking photographs on the balcony earlier. And finally, our thanks go to our club chairman, Professor Peter Garside, for his stylish and gracious chairing of this evening's proceedings. Ladies and gentlemen, please join with me in thanking them all.
Ladies and gentlemen, Madeleine's vote of thanks brings our evening to a beautifully rounded close. I look forward to seeing you at our various talks throughout the year. Our next event on Thursday the 16th of May, we will hold then our annual general meeting at 7 o'clock, followed by a talk by Lieutenant Commander Dermot Gunn, OBE, on the subject of Sir Walter Scott, Impressions of Russia. Dermot is a recent recipient of a Pushkin Medal for his services in promoting Russian-British cultural understanding and is an expert in this field. I hope as many of you as possible will be able to attend. Subsequently, Professor Thomas Richardson will be talking to us on Scott and John Gibson Lockhart on the 20th of June, tickets for which are also still available. We are indeed blessed as a club in having in Sir Walter a figure capable of engendering such a multitude of topics and activities. There are more talks and events to follow later in the year, which will be fully announced in the next Secretary's letter from Louise Gardner to members in the early summer. But for this evening, thank you all for coming and have a safe journey home.